Welcome to Between Two Pastries, a not-so-typical nutrition podcast. Nicole and Annie are licensed and registered dietitians. Join them as they discuss hot nutrition topics, challenge popular beliefs, and have a blast doing it. Here are your hosts, Nicole and Annie.
Welcome, everybody, to Between Two Pastries. This is Nicole.
Hey, everyone, it's Annie.
Today, I know we are always excited for guests, but we are 1000% over the moon for our guests because we're so happy to have her back. We are welcoming Miss Christy Harrison back on our show. So excited. I actually kind of peeped a little bit to some of our listeners and I'm like, oh, we're going to have Christy back. And they were just so excited, Christy. So welcome, Christy. We are really happy to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be back.
Yay!
I even told my husband today, I was like, oh yeah, we're interviewing Christy again. He's like, oh really? That's great. And my husband is, my husband. So
right, yeah. So even he's excited.
Even he was excited. I was like, oh, sweet.
That's awesome. So for those that might be, new to our pod or new to hearing Christy's name too, Christy, you just have such a wonderful background. Do you mind just introducing yourself a little bit?
Sure, not at all. So I'm Christy Harrison. I am an anti-diet registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, journalist, and author of 2 books now. Anti-Diet, which was out in 2019, is available in hardcover and paperback, and then The Wellness Trap, which will be coming out in early 2023 and is available for pre-order now. I forgot I also host a podcast of my own called Food Psych, so I should probably throw that in there as well.
Yes, absolutely. And we will get all the links in there. Podcast is amazing. And even though you're doing nice abbreviated sessions, they are always so packed with so much information. So we thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I had to pare it down for my coming back from maternity leave. I realized,
oh my gosh,
having a baby and juggling work and parenthood is a lot, and doing all the interviews I used to do is just not going to happen. So
no, but it's great that you're still doing what you can, and again, your work is just so great, and so we're so happy to have you here today. So really excited. I was so excited when I actually saw that you were coming out with your new book, The Wellness Trap. And again, a topic that Annie and I talk about an awful lot. And I cannot wait to see the research and everything that you found. So wherever you kind of want to start off around that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think The Wellness Trap is, both of my books have been sort of personal to me because I struggled with disordered eating myself. And so that was kind of the impetus to start researching for anti-diet. But The Wellness Trap is more about my own, it was more motivated anyway by my own struggles with multiple chronic illnesses. I have multiple autoimmune conditions, including Hashimoto's thyroiditis. I have an autoimmune bleeding disorder. I have eczema. I have all these different things that, wellness culture tends to push people to want to fix with food. And that's really the line that we get these days. And so I think, that's been building for the last 10 or 20 years, right? And I was first diagnosed with some of these conditions about 20 years ago. And that's what pushed me into disordered eating and really sort of an orthorexic style of eating disorder where I was obsessed with quote unquote healthy eating and clean eating before it was even called that. And drove me down this rabbit hole of real disorder with food and my body. But there was also this whole other side of it that I didn't get into in anti-diet, which is like the alternative wellness, the alternative health. Now it's often called integrative or functional medicine approaches to wellness, or what the wellness culture terms wellness, which to me really is this unattainable and often oppressive ideal of what well-being is supposed to look like. And it really ignores a lot of the factors that promote what I consider to be true well-being, namely mental health and social relationships and considering social factors and social determinants of health. And, so all of that I've been seeing for years, and in my private practice, helping people recover from disordered eating, have just been seeing this growing sort of array of people struggling with orthorexia type eating disorders. And orthorexia is defined as an obsession with quote unquote healthy eating. And I think that's just become more and more prevalent for people with all different kinds of eating disorder diagnoses over the past, decade or so. But then I think with the pandemic and the explosion of social media and sort of more attention to mis and disinformation on social media and how algorithms push people down these rabbit holes of extremism, all of that just really piqued my interest and got me thinking about writing a book that does a deep dive into wellness culture and sort of how did we get here? How do we get to the place where people are so, where like the medical medium is a best-selling author who has no health credentials or any sort of background in health or science or research and just says that he's channeling a spirit that diagnoses people with medical conditions. And this is someone who's like very well known and famous and endorsed by celebrities. And I'm just like, how did this happen, right? And what sort of cultural and social factors pushed us to this point? And just doing this research took me down such fascinating rabbit holes of my own, finding the ways in which social media algorithms promote mis and disinformation about wellness and health, and all the scams and sort of unsavory characters that we see in the wellness space. But also, everyday people kind of stumbling into wellness through various means, often, having chronic conditions like I do, or sometimes new parents looking for, research on the best way to raise their kids, and then suddenly getting into these things that are really, really unhelpful and actually taking them farther away from true well-being. So I interviewed a lot of people for the book who, through one way or another got into some really dubious diagnoses, got diagnosed with conditions that in many cases don't actually exist by integrative and functional medicine providers or other alternative and complementary, practitioners, which all sort of fall under this umbrella of wellness practitioners, and looking at the harm that causes. I also traced the connection between diet culture and wellness culture, which is, I talked about a bit in my first book. Actually, the second chapter of my first book is all about the connection between wellness and diet culture. And this new book kind of like just really blows that out. So looking at, how people get sort of pulled into problematic wellness culture through the desire to maybe get thin or get healthy or get fit. And it's just been such a fascinating sort of deeper dive into some of the stuff that I was already researching and interested in for years. I've been, talking to people about, well, is there actually any evidence for this diet, right? My functional medicine provider said I need to cut out X, Y, and Z to manage this condition or to prevent X, Y, certain health condition. Is that really true, right? And doing a deep dive into the scientific research and finding, well, no, there's very little evidence and no really compelling or solid evidence to support this type of diet, right? But then also there's just so much more to the story. And so this book took me in so many interesting directions, and it's kind of hard to describe and summarize. But I think the subtitle, excuse me, I think the subtitle does a decent job of sort of capturing the breadth of it, which is break free from diet culture, disinformation, and dubious diagnoses, and find your true well-being. So that's sort of what I'm doing in this second book is trying to explore those things and help people find a path towards supporting their well-being in a way that's actually true and that promotes true well-being rather than leading them down this path of wellness culture that I think is often a very dangerous one.
Yeah, it is very dangerous. Just listening to all of the avenues that you went down to, I'm thinking, my gosh, your book could be like 500 pages long at least, with 100 of them being references. So,
yes, yeah.
I mean, it's absolutely crazy. So I'm so curious because all of these things in my mind, I'm like, what did you research around when so much of this stuff really started, the whole concept of wellness?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, you could take it in many directions, right? The word wellness itself entered the lexicon, and I think it was the 1800s. I'm going to get those numbers wrong because my brain is sort of mush right now as a new mom, and I also have to like go over my page proofs again and again to really cement those kinds of numbers. But I believe it was in the 1800s that that word entered the lexicon, and it was just as an antonym for illness, right? Wellness versus illness. But in this sort of modern context that it's used, where it's like about optimization, right? It's about not just absence of illness, but really optimizing yourself, optimizing your health, and, you know, sort of achieving some loftier goal of what health can be, or, you know, a wellness that is over and above just kind of basic health, basic absence of disease. That really didn't come into the lexicon until the 1950s. And there was a man named Halbert Dunn who sort of wrote the first books or lectures, and then were turned into books about this concept of wellness called, he called them high level wellness. And his ideas about wellness, while, you know, it sounds like something that might resonate with today's wellness culture, actually have a lot more in common with what I would consider true well-being, which is more focused on psychological and social dimensions. He talks really a lot about those, and sort of the need for social support and, you know, stress reduction and things like that, and focuses very little on food or weight issues. There are a couple little references to food and weight, but really the only reference to food is like making sure that people eat enough. And the only reference to weight, there's some slight, you know, anti-fat bias in there, but it's nothing compared to what wellness culture is today, right? It's like kind of one offhanded little comment. And so that's kind of like who people point to as the father of wellness. And then there were, in the 1970s, right, like this, so 1959, early 1960s, Halbert Dunn's work was getting somewhat popular among a very small circle of public health professionals. He himself was a public health professional, but it didn't really catch on in a mainstream way. And, you know, it kind of maybe could have ended there, but in the 1970s, a guy named John W. Travis, who was studying to be a doctor, a medical student, discovered one of Halbert Dunn's books on like a remainder table or something in his local bookstore, right? It was like deeply discounted, and he was like, oh, this is interesting. Picked it up and was very inspired himself. And you know, that's sort of who a lot of people now point to as one of the fathers of, you know, wellness culture as we know it today, right? This idea of, he sort of helped take it into this idea of like optimization and bringing a lot of kind of new age thinking and alternative modalities into it, because you know, initially Halbert Dunn's idea of high level wellness didn't involve a lot of that, but then in the 1970s, that was all sort of in the zeitgeist too, right? There was this sort of cultural revolution that had happened, and with that there was a lot of desire to just tear down institutions, bring in new ideas from different cultures, and, you know, sort of taking things out of the realm of science and academia and looking more towards, there's a lot of fetishization actually, and sort of Orientalism around like Eastern quote unquote philosophies and healing modalities. And so that was the context in which Travis was operating. And there were some other kind of figures, you know, other doctors that were in the same boat, in the same cultural context, that were also fans of Halbert Dunn and kind of amplifying his messages, but taking it and sort of twisting them in this way that was very 1970s, right? That it was filtered through this lens of what was going on in the culture at the time.
Sure.
And one of the things, unfortunately, that was going on in the culture at the time was some major fat phobia and, you know, food shaming, right? Like sort of ideas about good and bad foods and what foods to eat and avoid. And some of that was coming from that political place of, you know, the counterculture, wanting to bring in more organic and sustainable foods and sort of get away from industrial food production. And I think, you know, in a social sense, I understand that. I understand sort of the value of that. But then also there's this, you know, moralization that happens that I think is really detrimental to people's relationships with food, actually. And that really crept into some of the early writings about wellness from these 1970s folks. who really made it into like primarily about food and exercise and, you know, weight stuff. And sort of this idea of like social connectedness and the importance of emotional well-being really sort of got sidelined at that point. And so I think that's where we started to see wellness culture as we know it today take off. And there was very much this idea too of optimization, of, you know, being your best self. And I think capitalism and, you know, the sort of late stage capitalism that we're in now has really taken that and ran with that also, right? The idea of self-optimization has now led to things like biohacking and, you know, people wanting to live to 120 and doing all sorts of things, taking, you know, fistfuls of supplements every day and doing all sorts of weird experimental things to their bodies to try to achieve that, right? And there's always been, you know, of course, sort of interest in longevity, right? The idea of the Holy Grail or, you know, alchemy and things like that. Like there's always this idea of wanting to extend lifespan, but I think wellness culture has taken it to new extremes and also married it with capitalism and with, you know, this sort of very Eurocentric and, you know, ideas that have very racist roots around what it looks like to be healthy or what, you know, who deserves wellness or who's able to afford wellness as well, right? It's sort of, there's a lot of issues around access and the ignoring of social determinants of health, and sort of seeing wellness as a very individual pursuit that are super problematic, right? And then also the rampant cultural appropriation of like indigenous traditions and non-Western traditions that in many cases practitioners don't really know about or aren't steeped in and are sort of adopting willy-nilly or piecemeal in order to sell their version of wellness to their audience. And oftentimes that ends up in a lot of harm being done as well to both the audience or the buyers of that content and to the cultures that are being appropriated from as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think so much about how much is on what's available now, even on social media, you know, with just practitioners, if we want to call them that, who just don't have the credentials and just kind of create this whole concept of wellness based on their own filter. You know?
And oftentimes it's their own experience. They're not at
Yes.
all, you know, I mentioned the medical medium, but there's, you know, countless people like that who are just speaking based on their own personal ideas and experience without any sort of training. In the book, I cover Belle Gibson, who's one of the sort of best known contemporary wellness scammers who, you know, if people don't know the story, she faked having cancer and posted about, you know, pretending to have cancer on Instagram, pretending to be healing it through whole foods and, you know, alternative practices alone. You know, she was supposedly foregoing conventional treatments, foregoing chemotherapy and stuff like that. And, you know, influenced who knows how many people to try to do the same, when in fact she didn't have cancer at all. And it came out a few years later after she had this meteoric rise and book deals and, you know, an app that was the most popular app in the Apple store in the world. And, you know, all of this really just so much damage done through her influence. And, you know, the media organizations and social media algorithms that elevated her as well, right? And amplified her message when she had nothing there to back it up. And that's a really egregious example of this, but I think that is happening on a much smaller scale every single day. You know, countless influencers around the world are doing this sort of thing in much smaller ways.
Well, and I think, you know, the thing that, and Annie and I talk about this a lot too, is just there's such a lack of like responsibility. Like, you know, we've always been taught, right? Like going into, you know, the dietitian world and the training that we've had, the first thing is do no harm. You know, there's this base level of massive amounts of responsibility. And I just feel like that's such a lacking piece, unless they're just oblivious and they think they're being responsible. I mean, I don't know.
I also think, you know, like if people teaching a class of students at the university of dietetic students, and hearing they had to watch a documentary about anything and then tell me if it was evidence-based or not, essentially. And I can't tell you how many of them watched documentaries on God only knows what on Netflix, and they all came back and like, well, yeah, I agree, like we shouldn't be eating this way. And I'm like, I didn't ask you to agree or disagree. I asked you to tell me if it was peer reviewed and evidence-based and what was
Right.
going on. So like when you say, to Joe Blow dietitian, are you following the code of ethics or, do no harm? It is totally in the eye of the beholder.
Right.
And so, and Nicole and I, Christy, were talking about this before you hopped on, just my experience with a family, and they're very homeopathic, and don't let the kids eat anything, and comments the 3 and 2-year-old have made to me about not eating sugar or packaged foods. And it just blows my mind, the influence beyond social media,
Yeah.
just what goes on in a person's household. And I know the parents mean no harm, but
Totally.
the damage that is going to come from that
Mm-hmm.
is outrageous.
Well, that's the thing too. People are really trying to do the best they can with the circumstances they're in. And I think a lot of parents want to help their kids, be healthy, avoid issues and things like that. But the messages that they're getting are
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
so skewed, so unfortunately not evidence-based, and often sensationalized through the algorithms amplifying the most extreme things, right? And so
Right.
people
Right.
get into things like homeopathy, which, unfortunately there's no evidence base for. There's been
Right.
numerous studies over many, many years showing that. And yet this modality keeps cropping up again and again that, people are finding and getting led to by algorithms or by functional medicine or integrative medicine providers or other alternative medicine providers or people in their life. And yeah, it's having so much impact and doing so much harm, unfortunately.
Yeah, definitely.
And just looking at your book, and obviously I haven't read it yet, but just the title, The Wellness Trap. I mean, I think people get in that cycle of, I fear this whatever it is happening,
Mm-hmm.
so I start to do these probably okay things, but then all of a sudden it can become orthorexic. But then I end up getting the thing I was trying to not get, the cancer, the illness, the thing. And now I still blame food, but really there's so many other variables. And we're stuck in that wellness trap because so many more so businesses and schools frame wellness as like these 6-7 different things. It's
Right.
beyond food, it's spiritual, it's this, and it's just like, how do you expect a 13-year-old to fill all of these boxes?
Mm.
Like they're changing every day, and they have good days and it's just, we're sometimes wellness, I feel like, is worse almost than diet culture in a way, because at least diet culture is just food. It's just language. It's just one avenue, where wellness can encompass so much, and, sometimes bring about shame because you can't check all 20 boxes in the wellness category sometimes. And that can be more detrimental to people.
Right, right. People feel so ashamed and blame themselves for conditions that they have that are completely out of their control. And like you said, people can get cancer despite having the most quote unquote clean diet in the world. Like,
Right.
people have genetic conditions that they were probably going to get no matter what.
Mm.
And yet wellness culture conditions them to blame themselves and feel like there's got to be more they can do. And so they double down and, cut
Yeah.
out even more foods and
Right.
start becoming even more orthorexic or, do even more extreme other types of practices. And I get it. I understand being desperate
Mhm.
for healing and desperate for
Mhm.
answers. And, I should say, like, the context to all of this too is that the healthcare system is failing a lot of people. The conventional healthcare system, I think, is not doing its job for many people. And,
Mhm.
especially those with chronic illnesses, it's kind of leaving some of us behind or making us feel dismissed or ignored. And, I know for me, like having multiple chronic illnesses that affect different systems of my body, it's really hard to go to one doctor and have them address all of the things that I have going on. It's like I have to go to 5 different specialists who don't talk to each other and
True enough.
might prescribe something that's going to
Yes.
interact with something else or, trigger something else that I have going on. And there's nobody there to kind of like manage the whole thing. And I've had to become my own advocate. I think so many people with chronic conditions have had to become their own advocates. And I think that's where it also gets really dicey because like then we're searching for this stuff online, right? The Google algorithm is tracking us, Facebook's, tracking cookies or
Right.
tracking code on different websites or tracking us. And so then all of this stuff starts getting fed into our social media and following us around the internet and, pulling us in this direction, right? When really we just wanted to try to figure out like what's going on with my body? What can I do to, support my well-being?
So I'm thinking about your book, Christy, and I'm curious about a couple things. I'm kind of curious about how you broke down chapters. Like I'm super excited to read this thing. And then I'm also, well, just because, your intro alone, it's like, gosh, there's so many avenues you can go down. And again, you were kind of alluding to, you were researching one thing and then you were led to another. And so it's just like, my gosh. So I'm curious on how you broke the book down. And then I'm also curious, it's a two-parter. I'm also curious on what a favorite section was, like what you were just like, wow, or just really enjoyed doing. I mean, this topic is hard, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, so on the breakdown of the book, I will say like I pitched it one way in my book proposal, and my publishers and editors were like, great, looks good, like do that. And I did that. And then I was like, I don't know, this feels weird. It doesn't quite flow. It's, a little awkward and clunky. Turned it in. My editor was like, yeah, this doesn't flow. This doesn't work. We have to like completely overhaul the structure and sort of the order of the chapters and even what's in certain chapters, like which, what sections go in what chapter, and kind of left it to me. She gave some suggestions, but it was largely like up to me to do that overhauling. So this was the hardest revision I've ever had to do. I've been a journalist in some capacity or another, writing professionally for 20 years now. And this is definitely the hardest revision, including with the first book, that I've ever had to do. So yeah, finding a way to structure it and kind of break everything down was the hardest part. But what I ended up doing was, starting with kind of where I start, which is diet culture, right? That's sort of what started this whole thing. And so that's the first chapter, is like how wellness culture and diet culture came to be so entangled. There's history there, because initially I had broken it up like sort of time wise, like we'll do the history first and then we'll go forward in time, and that didn't really work. So it's like there's history throughout the book, kind of scattered in different chapters relevant to whatever topic we're talking about. And so the first chapter on diet culture is where I talk about the history of how the concept of wellness came to encompass diet culture. And I really theorize that, wellness culture like subsumed diet culture's value system for its own, and also has, all these other values that it kind of tacks on that are related to like denigrating conventional medicine and denigrating science and lionizing forms of healing that are seen to be like outside the mainstream or quote unquote Eastern or, non-traditional, et cetera. And then I move on to talking about the other things other than diet culture that wellness kind of touches that are related to diet culture. So like, people starting to become really afraid of what's in their household products, or starting to become really obsessed with what's in their beauty products, or with what, kind of like what you're putting in and on and around your body. This idea of, wellness as affecting all of your environment, your spaces. And then I started talking and thinking about, who is that for, right? Who has the privilege to access that, and what is missing from that version of wellness, and thinking about like social determinants of health and how wellness culture ignores those, and the ways in which social determinants affect people's well-being, and the need to think about things like poverty, racism, other forms of discrimination, how those impact people at the physical and mental health levels.
Mm.
And, that led to thinking about trauma, right? The impact of trauma on the body,
Absolutely.
and how conventional medicine really doesn't have great, and conventional, even, mental health care doesn't have great treatments for trauma a lot of the time. And people with trauma are often misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed and undertreated,
Yep.
and the ways in which that affects, physical well-being. And then from there, I started thinking about the internet as a social determinant of health. This is a really interesting avenue. And I think to your question about like what was most interesting to me, or what did I most enjoy reporting, I think that was it. Thinking about first, internet and social media as a determinant of health that kind of affect or is interrelated with all the other determinants of health. And then how that is, affecting people's well-being at the societal level, at the individual level, and looking at the ways in which, algorithms drive people towards mis and disinformation, what is incentivized on social media. And really it's, seeing how anger and moral outrage are actually the things that drive the most engagement, and the algorithms prioritize engagement, right? That's what
Right.
social media companies want, is for you to spend the most time on their platform, keep refreshing, keep clicking, keep going down rabbit holes, because then
Gosh.
you're spending more time and getting exposed to more advertising, and that's how they make their money.
Ugh.
And so, there's really good, well-documented evidence now, including like Frances Haugen's testimony to Congress and the Wall Street Journal reporting based on her leaks of the Facebook files. Like that all came out when I was writing this
Yeah.
book, when I was sort of in the end
Nice
stages
timing.
of writing this. So it was like, jumping on that and really like doing a deep dive and finding out as much as I could about that. And, I had been thinking for years, like personally, I think the harms of social media have affected me. I mean, one of my chronic health conditions is PTSD. And so I have a little bit of a trigger for certain things. Anyway, like
Yeah.
sort of bad social vibes, like really,
Sure.
really get to me. And I think more so than a lot of people, I sort of have feelers out for that, and had just been noticing online, like just these bad dynamics happening in groups of people that I otherwise really loved. And like, how is this possible? How is this happening? And, having to really like take myself out of a lot of spaces online and build a lot of boundaries around how I use social media, and taking lots of breaks, and, just back and forth, and so much angst about it. And so, I had been researching and thinking about that, like that this can't just be a me problem, right? This has got to be, something bigger is going on here. And I had been reading about like the harms of, social media in terms of privacy and in terms of political polarization and things like that for a while. But, it really, I think Frances Haugen's testimony about how Instagram drives teenage girls toward pro-anorexia or pro-eating disorder content, from like a simple search and like of healthy eating accounts. From there, it's a pretty short, series of steps to pro-anorexia content, right? And so, and seeing too, like the anti-vax, that's another part of this book that was really fascinating to me, was reporting on that, talking of people who were former anti-vaxxers about how they got radicalized and how they got out, and seeing the role that social media played, and, other online communities as well. But like primarily it was happening on social media, that people were fed these recommendations, and, being in these sort of echo chambers of other anti-vax or vaccine hesitant people that kind of, fed in content, and, there were targeted ads given to those folks. And again, it was a lot of people who were like new moms or soon to be moms, or soon to be parents, like looking for information about how to help their kids. Right. And so that whole nexus of like how these algorithms and how these online spaces are driving wellness misinformation, which is, false information, bad, non-evidence-based, sometimes totally made up information, and then also disinformation, which is like misinformation with the intent to deceive. So there are, literally Russian bots that had been dedicated to, and trolls dedicated to sowing chaos in the 2016 election, that then turned their attention toward vaccines and started putting out anti-vaccine information into the system, and, you know, sort of creating chaos and a sense of like greater disagreement about vaccines or greater support for anti-vaccine thinking than actually existed in the American populace. And then, you know, a couple years down the line, you have like a genuine public health problem with people, you know, with a hugely growing movement refusing vaccines and refusing, you know, the COVID-19 vaccine in the middle of a pandemic and things like that. So, yeah,
I mean,
it's just
refusing
it's,
all vaccines.
Right.
yeah, right,
It's like measles and polio, and like
right.
it's
Polio.
unreal.
It's really sad, and it's, you know, I was just struggling to understand it at first. Like, how do people kind of get bought into that? But the folks that I talked to who were formerly in the anti-vaccine movement, I started to understand, like, you know, the empathy that they had, the desire to really help their families and their kids, and the vulnerability that they had. You know, that someone kind of fed them some bad information at a vulnerable time in their life, and suddenly they were radicalized, you know, or they were put into the radicalization engine, I should say, that is, you know, Facebook and Instagram and other social media, and then and other, you know, other forms of technology as well, and also other kind of offline communities of people who were stridently advocating this stuff. And then suddenly you have people, you know, refusing all vaccines for their child and ending up with a child. You know, one woman I talked to for the book had a child who ended up with 105-degree fever from the flu because she had refused the flu vaccine, and, you know, they had to rush her to the hospital, and
Yeah.
just heartbreaking, you know. But this is someone who thought that vaccines were going to kill her daughter, that the
Sure.
vaccine itself was going to be the harmful agent, you know, not realizing, and later, you know, coming to see, like, that these infectious diseases are, you know, that's the real harm, right? That's the real thing to fear.
Well,
So yeah.
Nicole and I talk about this a little bit too, where, you know, so many people, you know, speaking about diet culture, they engage in diet culture and do X, Y, or Z diet and all these extremes, and they don't want to listen to what we say. And there's this inability to, you know, to hear the other side. And I feel it's probably the same way, right, with vaccines. So how did people, you know, whether it's food or vaccines or whatever, how did they change their view? I mean, some people don't change their view even when their kid is dying.
Right.
They still can't give that up. So, I mean, did you meet anyone like that?
You know, I made an intentional choice not to talk to people who were still in the movement, the anti-vaccine movement, because I have come to understand how harmful it is to platform that type of thinking, right? And so
Totally.
Very good. Very good.
So I wanted to understand the thinking. I wanted to, like, you know, be able to empathize with people's reasons for going into this, but I also didn't want to talk to anyone who was still bought in. So I looked for people who were former anti-vaxxers. I think that, like, formers of anything are really fascinating types of people to talk to. You know, I find that those kinds of interviews really interesting, and I'm a former, you know, many things myself, right? So, but yeah, so I didn't talk to anyone who was still bought in, but to the people I did talk to who had gotten out, and also the research I've seen on this too, I think the common thread is, like, finding just having someone who has empathy and who will continue to talk to you through it. Like, this one woman, Heather Simpson, I talked to, had a friend who was, I think she was a nurse, and she was, you know, a really good friend, and just someone who was open and empathetic, and sort of would hear Heather's side of things, and then say, well, have you considered this? Or actually, this is what I have learned. And, you know, just kind of gentle pushback and delivery of information, not debating, not sort of trying to take her down or anything, and just holding space for her and continuing to be her friend. And one of the really harmful things that sometimes happens is that, understandably, I think some people need to need to take a step back from a friend who's gotten radicalized like that, or a family member. But unfortunately, then it's like that person is even more isolated, even more left to their own devices with the radicalizing community. And so dives even deeper because they don't have that offline or that, real life kind of support.
Yeah.
And so I think that as difficult as it is for many people to have to listen to that type of thing, I think staying in the life of a person who's struggling with that stuff, if you can, and just continuing to support them and not, yelling at them as you might want to sometimes, but being a listening ear and, empathizing with them, but also giving them whatever you can of, what you understand to be the truth about vaccines or whatever it might be, is probably the best approach.
Yeah, definitely. So as we're kind of wrapping things up, Christy, it was just, I think it's pretty obvious what your main goal was as far as, creating this book, but I'm curious in your own words, what was your main goal for creating this book?
I think it was to help people avoid falling into the wellness trap, avoid the harms that I and so many people I've seen have experienced, and to try to imagine what a world would look like beyond this, like what true well-being could be and what steps we might need to take to get there. And of course, like, I'm just one person, this is my take, right? But
Sure.
I think having some idea of, what structurally might need to change or what like legally might need to change to make, for example, the internet and social media a safer place for people's well-being and, to promote true well-being. I think that's really important. So yeah, I wanted to just think through all of these things that had been on my mind for a long time and alert other people to some of the dangers that I see out there in the wilds of wellness culture.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, we wish you all the best of success with this book. And it's currently on pre-order, correct?
That's right. Yeah, you can pre-order it pretty much wherever you get your books. ChristyHarrison.com/The Wellness Trap is where you can go to see lots of different places to pre-order, see the description, and I'm going to have some pre-order bonuses that I'll be announcing at some point.
Awesome.
So yeah, if you can kind of learn all about that on my website. And thank you so much for having me. It's really great.
Absolutely. And then the official drop date of your book is April
25th of 2023.
Very, very cool. Wonderful. And as we do with every interview session, and as you answered in the past, has your favorite food changed from last time? I don't even know if you remember what you mentioned last time.
I don't even remember what I said last time.
Can I remind you? Because I remember. Yeah. Because I remember when we specifically got off the interview, I was like, I was not expecting that as her favorite food. And Annie said the same thing. You were very into specifically some like Korean flavors, like barbecue flavors at that time.
Oh, okay. Maybe bibimbap. Did I say bibimbap?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. And we were like, wow. Yeah, we weren't. So we're just totally wondering where you're at now.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's so funny. I like food has become so much more of just like a instrumental thing, I guess, these days.
Yes,
like, I mean, there's still pleasure around it, but it's, I'm having to eat quickly while taking care of a baby, and it's just become like much less of a production. But actually we do have a takeout, like a pizza place, a local pizza place in our neighborhood that has like brick oven pizza that's super delicious. And nice. It's a very, Italian style. There's like meatballs and grilled kale and, all these delicious things to go on the side as well. And then the pizzas themselves have like, fresh mozzarella or, there's different specials and things like that. And so I think that's been a favorite recently.
Oh, that's very fun.
Love that. Yummy.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thanks so much again for joining us, Christy. All the best.
Yes,
thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Have questions you want to hear discussed on the show? Find us on Facebook or visit betweentwopastries.com and drop us a line. Want to support the show? Find us on Patreon for exclusive content. If you love the show, find us on iTunes or your favorite podcast platform. Hit the subscribe button and leave us a review.